I'd like to introduce our first keynote, our lunch keynote here today. He's got so much experience having worked and operated in Asia. Friend of ours for many, many years at this point, and I'm very excited for you all to learn a little bit more about his experiences having worked in Asia for 25 plus years at this point. So without further ado, Drew Bernstein from MarcumAsia.
I have to thank, Bobby, a long time ago. But no, Bobby, obviously you, your mom, Lulu, and your dad have always been fantastic supporters of my firm and myself. And I know on behalf of all the Marcum people, we're eternally grateful to you and humbled to be here. So thank you for having me. When I first started in China, I had spent 17 years in Europe, and I thought China was just going to be another foreign place for me to work, and turned out quite different. When I first started, there were no maps in the hotel in English. It was hard to find somebody even at the Peninsula Hotel that spoke English. And it was incredibly, we had to work all through translators. And what happened was, you can imagine, as coming out of Europe, I love to eat. And, now I get to China, I'm stuck in a hotel because you can't go outside the hotel because you never find your way back. And even if you did find your way back, how could you order food? It was just impossible. Then one time I was off to China, and kind of a light bulb went off in my head. Ran out of my office, hopped into a cab, went down to Chinatown, and I went to all the different Chinese restaurants, Beijingese, Shanghainese, Cantonese, and I collected all the takeout menus. And when I went back to China, there was this Peking restaurant across the street. I remember walking proudly into it. They all looked at me like, they call us Lawais back then. They called us Dabiza, big nose. And I go into the restaurant. Everybody was just looking at me. I sat down. I circled chicken and broccoli. And the waiter came over and was just shocked for the first 30 seconds. But, chicken and broccoli is chicken and broccoli. So it worked. And I have the folder, and I would go to all my different restaurants, and I actually never even left the restaurant with the menu, because once I ate for free, because in the time of my meal, he copied the restaurant, put his name on it, and wanted me to proofread it. So it was an interesting time. I'm obviously kind of biased on China because it's been incredibly good to me. It's given me a very beautiful life. I have a thriving business there. I work with some of the finest professionals that are in the industry, and I might add some of the kindest people. And I've been very fortunate. For those of you who don't know me, my wife is Chinese, and I've been blessed because she compliments me in such a way that she allowed me to become something greater than I am. So I'm eternally grateful for China. Obviously, things changed a lot. Given the Made in 2025 plan, where China identified certain sectors that they wanted to excel at, you have to believe that in the last 50 years, and that's exactly, the United States and China have essentially been in a marriage for 50 years. And it's been a good marriage because both of them have become something greater than they were before. And China, in that 50-year period, became the second largest economy in the world and the second largest military. Now, I understand the geopolitical climate right now is not the best, but as we all know, in 50-year marriages, there's only usually two reasons people don't get divorced. Love's not one of them. The main reason people don't divorce after 50 years is because simply the other person just doesn't die. And the other reason they don't divorce is because they're not willing to diminish their lifestyle. And if China and the US ever did totally decouple, both of their lifestyles would greatly be diminished. The management in China right now has changed a lot. The excuses that we used to hear that I'm not familiar with US regulations, I don't speak English, those are just old stories. The Chinese particularly have had access to some of the best professional firms. They've had over 20 years experience in the public markets. And I think they've made significant progress in the management, the way it is today and the way it used to be. Corporate culture, not so much. Today in China, the chairman still runs the company. You don't normally see very effective boards, although board of directors can be very expensive in Asia because of the D&O insurance. And once you get US directors on the board, which is kind of what adds the credibility, companies can be paying upwards of $1 million a year for D&O insurance just for a board, on top of the directors' fees and such. So it can be a significant hurdle, especially for the microcaps. Accounting has not been a major, a Chinese company typically. In a US company, a CFO might be the first person you hire. In a Chinese company, it might be the last, even today. This is actually a real picture. That's what it looked like back then. It's become a lot more sophisticated these days. Back then, a Chinese chairman really didn't have that much to do during the day. His business really started at night, meeting with government officials, competitors, at Moutai dinners. And this is actually a real picture that I took from a folder. Because back then, even if a Chinese company had no business outside of China, the fact that they were able to go public on New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ gave them enormous credibility. It was very valuable. Today, government obvious has a more significant role. Nobody ever contemplated some of the security issues 20 years ago that we're seeing today. And what a company does what it sells today doesn't necessarily dictate whether it's security sensitive or not, because it could be purely the information that they have. And to really understand China operates on what I consider 4 pillars, just like a chair. One pillar is banking. One pillar is data security. The other is controlling how companies compete, the anti-competitiveness. And lastly, social welfare. We've seen over the last couple of years examples of each, right? If you recall Didi, that was about data security. You see the education industry, social welfare. Alibaba, fine, that was about controlling the way people compete. And Financial, nobody could figure out what that company did. It was into so many different things. So we've seen a lot more involvement by the government right now in dictating what companies can and can't do. Going global back then meant very different than what it meant today. Back then, one of the interests that Chinese companies had in going public in the US was that they were able to attain tradable currency, which was valuable in doing international acquisitions. They wanted to expand into European markets, and you can see some of the real estate that they bought around the United States. They were into trophy assets. Today, it's a totally different kind of market that they have. We've seen shifting, and so far I've been talking about China, because 20 years ago, when you talked about Asia, Japan was already in its decline, and Asia economically pretty much was China. And, we're going to kind of move the tour a little bit to Southeast Asia. because we've seen an enormous shifting right now. About 50% of our business right now is coming from non-China countries. You know, the allure when I started in China was really simple. Any business that you could dream of, I guaranteed you that when you plugged 1.3 billion into it, it worked every single time. And that was sort of the allure, the beginning of China, because people didn't really understand how big China is. You know, in the United States today, there's only 9 cities, possibly 10, San Jose being the 10th, that have populations over 1 million. Does anybody want to guess how many cities China has over 1 million? 161. And that's inclusive of 15 megacities, being defined as cities having populations 15 million and above. So you can understand what the allure was originally of China. The other thing that you had was reverse migration, a lot back then, because you had all the Chinese students coming to the United States, becoming highly educated. 20 years ago, the chairman of the company, chances are, never went to college. And when I talk to my staff today, I explain to them that they better get to know the chairman or the chairwoman's kids, because those are the ones that are going to be running the businesses now. My generation is about over. And these kids are highly educated. Today, obviously, there's a number of problems in China. Economic. For me, I kind of break it down into 3 main categories. One, the government basically, you know, I don't look at China as a communist country. I know it is technically defined as one, and there's only 4 of them. I think a more accurate description of China is an incredibly capitalistic society with a one-party system. Now, when you have a one-party system, it's sort of like a deal. Every deal is great on day one. But as the deal progresses, you have to reckon with the economics of it. And historically, people that wanted everything didn't fare too well. Secondly, I think the issue is they would like to have all the benefits of capitalism, except they want to run it with communism. And that doesn't really work, because you can't have capitalism and limit who and how much they make, just like defying gravity. And lastly, you have this severely declining population. They expect the population of China to drop over 100 million in the next 5 years. So increasing your business when the population is declining, obviously you have to look outside your borders. Now, you've seen right now somewhere, I don't know, close to 40% unemployment right now for kids under 30 years old. And that's the result of some of the governmental decisions, because it doesn't take much to understand over the last 15 years in Western civilizations, the economics have pretty much been driven by tech. And when you start to put restrictions on tech, well, that's who employs most of the young people. So it's not surprising the results. So you have sort of these government restrictions coming down, but economically, the Chinese have had to look outside their borders to increase their business. And trust me, they've done exactly that in some incredibly creative ways. I mean, anybody that's considering investing in China right now, and I understand it's not a very investable place, but I figured these are some common questions you might want to ask. After my 25 years in China, it's one of the only things I can tell you that's sort of absolute, is that this last one that I put in white, and that is, if you have a business that is aligned with government policy, you can make a lot of money. If you have a business that's not aligned with government policy, you will not make money. And if you're not sure that you have a business that aligns with government policy, means you probably shouldn't have been there in the first place. That's a guarantee. Now, we've talked about China because that Asia, as I said, was China. But as I mentioned, 50% of our business now is coming from outside of China. And when I say outside of China, obviously the principal benefactor has been Singapore. Singapore has become not only the bank of Southeast Asia, but it's also the technology capital of Southeast Asia. And for me, Southeast Asia is very much like Europe in one sense. You have a bunch of countries, speak different languages, have different customs and cultures, and economically all live and die together. That's Southeast Asia. Now, when I speak about Southeast Asia, I'm speaking specifically about, number one, Singapore. Number two, you would think it would be Indonesia because of the demographics. 280 million people, an average per capita income of about $4,000. And for those of you that know a little bit geography, you can kind of swim from Singapore to Indonesia, where it's 60,000 a year. So what we're seeing there, obviously, are industries like we saw in China 20 years ago. Education, consumer tech, green tech, because people in Southeast Asia feel the effects of global warming and understand it much better. Fintech, because people are starting to save more. Because you have to understand, when somebody makes $4,000 a year and doubles their income, 100% of that goes back into the economy. Malaysia. Malaysia for me is sort of blessed and cursed by the same thing. It's a 3-hour car drive from Singapore. So no business is going to actually put offices in KL because it's too close to Singapore. And on the flip side, it's so close that a lot of small deals get seen there that never would be seen anyplace else. I would add to the list, we're seeing business in the Philippines, a little bit from Thailand, and probably a more interesting one on the list, Vietnam. Vietnam is, I think, trying to take the pathway of Japan. For those of you that know some of the economic history of Japan, when I grew up, if you owned something from Japan, you threw it out. It broke the next day. And then what happened is Japan invested an enormous amount. Don't quote me, but it was something like 3 or 4% of GDP into 3 things: technology, education, and innovation. And in less than a 20-year period, with a little help from the World Bank, they created all of the companies that you know today. Sony, Nakamichi, Toyota, all of those companies were born in that era. And then they kind of went into a 20-year slide. And what we're seeing right now, I actually just came back from Japan a few days ago. I was at a NASDAQ conference there. And lo and behold, NASDAQ's holding a conference in Japan, Tokyo. And sitting behind me is the ex-guy that used to run New York Stock Exchange, emerging markets, all sitting in the same place. So what we're starting to see now is Japan is starting to become of interest right now. So Asia today is not defined anymore just by China. Now, I don't think there's any one country that could ever replace China. Don't even go there. But these are other interesting markets. Korea, obviously, there's some interesting companies in Korea, but we're not seeing the kind of unicorns yet, either in Korea or Japan. These are mostly small cap companies. That's why the NASDAQ conference was actually catered more to small caps. And this is the main point of what I want to make to everybody today. Now, I understand most of the people here are not Asian investors. But what I can tell you is over the next 10 years, the majority of the unicorns are coming from Asia. And when I talk about a unicorn company, I'm not just talking about a company that's over $1 billion. I'm talking about companies that are industry disruptive. I have about 5 or 6 minutes left, so I'm going to run through, but I actually came up with 4 examples of what I'm trying to talk about. And as I said, even though you may not want to invest in Asia, these companies are likely to be so industry disruptive, they're going to dictate how you invest here. Now, Shein is one of them. The Jews, we call it Shine, so either way you want to call it. But you're talking about a company right now that came out with 1.5 million designs last year. Now they sell in 150 countries, not China. Now, when they make an initial run of a garment, anybody want to guess how many they might run? How many might they make? You're selling in 150 countries? 100 million. Right number, too many zeros. They make 100. 100. And if it sells out, they'll make 200. And if it sells out, it's done. They have 0 left over. It's like 1%. And this company uses 5,000 independent designers that own the designs. So, I mean, I could speak a lot about this company. I've actually had some direct communications with them, and I've written about them. So this is one of them. Temu, I mean, everybody understands Temu, that's shop like a billionaire. And this company is actually challenging Amazon. Who thought you can have a Chinese company challenging Amazon here? TikTok is sort of an enigma for me, only because, we have decades of laws in the United States prohibiting foreign governments from owning news organizations for obvious reasons. And I think in this case here, the US government was able to make a good case that TikTok is essentially an electronic news organization. And I think that's perhaps why they were successful at banning this. My guess is that they're just going to close it down because the secret sauce, the algorithm, without that, the company is really not much. Tesla, I do write and I publish a column in Forbes, and I had just posted an article about Tesla. And I think Elon, for those of you that are following it, just did something that was so incredible. I can talk about this for a while. I probably only have a couple of minutes left. But if you understand what Elon did, is he understood that you cannot beat the Chinese in manufacturing anything. Because if you want to play that game, it's going to be a race to the bottom, because every day that goes by, they'll produce it $10 cheaper than you. And what Elon did is he realized that, and he didn't get into the race to the bottom. And says he's announcing August 8th, the AI robo-taxi. And what Elon is doing right now is a car is not going to be a car anymore. It's essentially going to be a robot, an AI robot. And his company, his AI company, will be collecting all of the data and mapping that almost every single car in the world is going to be using. Like every computer uses Windows pretty much. Well, almost every car is going to be using this mapping system. And you can imagine that the Chinese will never be able to sell a car in the United States that uses a Chinese mapping system because they'll never permit it. And Elon, over the weekend, was able to cut a deal with the Chinese. He got preliminary approval to be able to do exactly that. Sell his mapping system in China under an arrangement where the data would actually be kept in China, which we would never permit in the United States. So I think, he did something that's really incredible, and we have to see if he pulls it off. But it's kind of interesting. Our firm, MarcumAsia, We're owned half by Marcum, and I own the other half with my partner, but we focus strictly on Asian businesses. We don't represent any US businesses, only businesses that operate in Asia. We have almost 300 people right now. We have offices throughout China, 7 there, Hong Kong, Singapore. We have some of the most experienced people in the business that are working in most of the countries I described to you. I have to do this part of it. They make me. So we're one of the largest auditors. We're probably number 3 in China for auditing Asian companies. We audit more companies than KPMG and Ernst & Young right now. With that parent company, we're ranked as one of the top accounting firms. So, and in the world of public companies, it's about credibility. And I see the king just entered the room. Shelley? King Shelley? How did I do? See? Look, that was my presentation today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. As I mentioned before, I do write for Forbes. I have a column there that I post once a month usually. I do post some other places too. I'll be here the rest of the day. Any questions? Happy to answer. Thanks very much.